Major production funding provided by the Anne Ray Foundation, a Margaret A. Cargill philanthropy. Engagement funding provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Anne Ray Foundation, a Margaret A. Cargill philanthropy. WNED presents The Great American Read, a Facebook Live discussion on what makes a book classic. Please join in on the conversation. Email your questions and comments to fblive@wned.org. And now, please welcome your host, Aimee M. Levesque.
Hello and welcome to the Great American Read Facebook Live book discussion, What Makes a Book a Classic? My name is Aimee Levesque. I'm a professor of English at Buffalo State College, and I'm also the founder and executive director of Inclusive Theater of Western New York. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to thank our local partners in the Great American Read, the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, Talking Leaves Books, and Just Buffalo Literary Center. Today we'll be talking about what makes a book a classic with my two guests, Baroness Von Smith and Kam Jackson. Welcome. Thank you both for being here. Really excited to talk to you about this.
No problem.
Also, to our guests at home, we'd love to hear from you. So please leave your questions and comments under the video, and we'll try to respond to them during this live video stream. So let's jump right in. Baroness, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you like to read?
Sure. I'm an author and playwright myself, and by day, to eat and have a house, I am an environmental chemist. I read, it's probably easier for me to tell you what I don't read. I don't read a lot of thrillers. I don't read westerns, romance, but everything else pretty much I do. I'm a voracious reader. I don't read a lot of nonfiction. I leave that to my husband, and then he can tell me about the books.
But you've read the classics, so we're
Well,
loosely right. Kam, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you like to read?
I'm a music and graphic design student at UB. I really like reading mostly nonfiction books, I guess. Yeah. Books on how to do things and perspective. Think and Grow Rich, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, all that type of stuff. Some fiction, some classics, but that's pretty much.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being here. So we are going to jump right in, and we're going to go straight to what we're here for. What makes a classic a classic? So Kam, can you give us what defines a classic for you?
For me, a classic is a book that encapsulates an era and gives you a perspective or a lens to whatever time period it is.
Would you say that this encapsulation would then transcend time, or would it be like, are you in that moment, or a little bit of both?
A little bit of both. If it's really good and really vivid, it's a little bit of both. If not, then it's more like historical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Baroness, I would ask you the same. What defines a classic for you?
So, to me, this is like the literary question equivalent of the game Monopoly, which nobody plays the same way, nobody plays it correctly, and it ends in tears. And so to the point, it's interesting that you say that you think that a classic should encapsulate an era, because the definition that I tend to have handy is sort of the opposite of that. And it comes to me from what makes a classic cocktail. That was the best analogy I could find. Don't read anything into that. But the one criteria, there's three. The one was that it had gone farther than the bar where it was made. The second was that it was a popular drink. And the third was that it was also respected by other bartenders. And I thought that that transposes well to literature where, except for the first piece, because that may or may not be the case. I think there's something to be said for the American voice. I hear a lot of agents talk about the American voice, and there's certain authors even on this list that fall into that. So they may not go outside of the state. So that is something that's a bit wavery for my definition, but the idea that it is well written and also enjoyable is a stronger definition, I think, than the one I used to have, which was that it had to resonate, which I still believe in, but I think that's part of being good and popular, and also transcend. And I wonder, and I was thinking this as I was coming here, because you're younger than me, you're a college student, if that definition even of a classic changes.
It almost does, because I feel like when I say it encapsulates an era, that almost gives you like a textbook feel. But even something more fantasy driven, like Harry Potter, still encapsulates the period that it came out in. You know, that culture and that love for fantasy. You know, there's a lot of people that relate to that story in particular here. It doesn't have to be so based in reality.
Right, or something that's set in the future.
Yeah.
So it's the rules of that world.
Yeah.
Have to be consistent and maintained, and also give you a sense of stepping into it and then
Yeah,
stepping out of it.
because that's what made it popular in the first place. Whatever the writer wrote struck a chord with the people of that time.
Right.
You
And
know?
that was part of my definition for myself, was it needs to resonate with you. I have subscriptions to a handful of literary magazines, and there's a lot of them are published by younger people, and then there's The New Yorker. And the ones by younger people, typically I see, because it's younger people that are often getting published too, and you can definitely see there's some beautiful lines in here, and there's good characterization, or a really vivid imagery of a place. But sometimes you get to the ending and it falls a bit flat, and so what you remember are these bits instead of that overall feeling. Right. Whereas with The New Yorker, more consistently, not always, but more consistently, it's the case that you'll get pulled through by the characters or the plot or something that's interesting going on in the background, but then you read the last paragraph or so and you set it down and pause, and you're like overwhelmed for a moment of that resonance. And for me, that is a big part. I don't want to say of what makes a classic, but I think that's what makes people enjoy it, and also other literary people respect it.
Well, you just kind of tipped on it. My next kind of thing I was going to pose to you, do you think the character or characters play a role in forming that classic?
Definitely. Because you have to have different attributes for different types of people. There's always a hero, there's always a villain, there's always the hero's best friend, and it's essentially the same timeless information restructured. The plot lines are never really too different, but it's just the characters that makes the information a little bit more digestible.
Certainly. So someone like Stephen King, who writes, he never really tells us what his characters look like, right? But there are people that will list a Stephen King novel as a classic, right? But to you as a reader, they're vivid. So it's also that kind of that strange piece too. So you don't necessarily.
He has said he does that on purpose.
On purpose, yes.
So that you can fill in people that you know or people from your neighborhood,
which
then
is why
makes
that works.
It, right, draws you in, right? And that's funny because I don't know. I do like Stephen King. I don't love Stephen King. Some people love him. I mean, he's a person. He's great. He lives in Maine, right near my parents. But he writes horror. It's genre. That he's done some stuff more recently that would be more easily labeled literary. But overall, he's a genre writer, and it's really hard to elevate a genre, I think, into literature. But he has said he sketches his characters roughly, but then you'll find agents and editors who will say, well, we need these characters to be very well defined, and some of it is personal preference, I guess, whether it's the reader or an agent or an editor. They're trying to sell your book. They think they know what people want to read.
That's when business comes into play.
Absolutely.
But when you're making a good story, I think any good storyteller will leave it open for interpretation. It's like poetry, extended poetry, and you can fill it with what is relevant to you.
Right.
You know, what does buildings and decoration look like in your world, and you piece it together. But I think with movies and movie interpretations,
it changes the game, right?
Yeah, because you now have a concrete perspective on what would have been totally different for you.
And it's interesting because the number one cardinal rule of writing is show, don't tell. Right? In writing. And so in writing, you describe a room, but you bring emotion into that description somehow, typically. But then now somebody has to put it on a screen, and it's a handful of people's interpret, like Harry Potter's a great
business.
Right, and business.
Yes.
So I think that
more
the
explosions than
movification of literature, or just writing in general, or even commercial fiction, is very definitely pushing it into the business realm, which is maybe good and maybe bad. I mean, I think a lot of younger people especially are first introduced to a lot of books from the movie, but I don't know. I was always taught by my parents, read the book first, and I don't know what changes if you're introduced to the movie first.
I think it depends on the individual, because if you really like the movie, you can get to the book and have a lot more unpacked. Like, whoa, these details wasn't expressed.
Okay.
You know.
But do you think, and this is probably depends on the individual, but for me, I know if I've seen a film of something, it's really hard for me to override that. And Hardy Boys was the first thing that happened to me. The Hardy Boys used to be a show, and I watched the show, and then I started reading the books.
The mysteries,
and
right?
Yes. And those boys always looked like the kids on the show.
Yeah.
Right? And I never, still to this day.
Because it impacts how you view it.
Absolutely.
I mean, I know a lot of students in particular that are utilizing things like weblogs and YouTube videos to kind of enhance their reading and understanding of novels that are not necessarily unattainable to them, but ones that they don't maybe necessarily understand as fully, like a Jane Austen, for example. You can go on and find really cute contemporary works on YouTube that are kind of the abbreviated or abridged version of what's happening. And then they come back, oh, this was great, but did you read the book? And oftentimes I get a no.
Yeah.
So
like the crib notes.
Yes, it's like cliff notes
cliff notes
for classics. And some of those things I think still need to be read, because I think your point in that being an interpretation, which is what a classic is, right? It varies obviously from each of us, but that idea that it will be different. And by watching just the interpretation, you're missing out on what was given to you in that text.
Yeah, and a good thing about classics are the level of detail in it and your sensitivity to have the imagination. And I feel like with our current culture and movies, you're kind of being desensitized to go back to the book and see those same details.
With your own kind of
because
mind's eye
you just
or
saw
whatever.
explosions, Tom
Right.
Cruise slide across the car, and you go back to this and a description
It's
of a flower
quiet,
petal.
Right? Yeah.
It doesn't do it for you.
Yeah.
You know.
What you said too about, I don't remember what it was, but the sort of the translation of, and I'm thinking also about literal translations, because it's always difficult to gauge what is lost and sometimes what is gained in translation. And I've read a couple different translations of like the famous Russian writers, and they're not generally, it's not always easy to pinpoint what's different, but there's definitely one that's better than the other sometimes, where it's like, oh, I just get more out of this. There's more for me to explore. I'm not being hit over the head with what this specific writer's more concrete interpretation was of something. So that's almost, it seems like a less of an issue now, or an issue that doesn't get discussed anymore because of the major, huge impact of video, whether it's movies or YouTube,
Right, because that's kind of changing how we are reading,
Take it in.
right? And
Right.
how we're taking things in. I just had a quick question come in. Thank you, and please keep bringing them in. If you just put them under the comments under the video, we can throw them out. So we have a question from Heather who says, "Classic sounds kind of stuffy. Are there any books you see as classics that aren't stuffy or academic?"
That aren't stuffy and academic. I mean, can I point out that we have a list of books
You can
right
absolutely.
Okay,
So the list that you're referring to is from the national poll of about 7,000 people, right?
Can they still vote? Can people still
And
vote?
people
Yes.
absolutely can still vote
can still
online
vote.
every day.
You vote early and often,
Yes.
apparently.
Canadians can also vote.
Yes, and Canadians, we welcome our Canadian friends to vote as well.
When I look at this, you got things like 1984. You got things like The Chronicles of Narnia, Charlotte's Web, the Twilight Saga, Lord of the Rings. None of this is really academic,
Interesting.
you know.
People would argue with you about Lord of the Rings. I'm not one of
Yeah,
those
yeah,
people,
yeah.
but people
No.
definitely will.
It
It's a book
has-
that starts with a map
Yeah.
and has its own language, and I think you can buy dictionaries of the language.
But
You can,
it's
but
just-
yes.
of Wookiee.
Yes.
But,
It's your perspective on what you think academic is.
right.
Because there are books that are more involved and that have a more fleshed out world, but that doesn't make it academic.
Academic or stuffy.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes hearing that classic word is almost a barrier for people.
Absolutely.
Like, I don't want to read that. That's a
Absolutely.
classic. It's going to be unattainable.
Well,
and I think like we shake that down a little with this list for sure,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right. Well, the other thing, when I said talk about the classics, somebody asked me about the classics recently, and I was like, I don't know anything about the classics. I only know Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and they're like, that's classic. And I'm like, to me, a classic is Homer or Shakespeare, perhaps. But again, that definition changes. Like a classic car is 25 years old, right? So my 1980s Honda was a classic, right?
Well, and we're conditioned to think of the old dead white guy novels, right?
Yeah.
That's where we go. Not that they aren't valuable, but that's where the head takes us, and we know that it's more than that. And especially our list is showing us that, we have some really great and prolific writers here, that we need to take that step back and really analyze what it means to be something that's, maintained over time.
I think the idea of what classic changes with the society, in the sense that you would think about the old dead white guys because it was also a society where that's what you're going to document.
Yes.
Right.
Now there's a lot more room for a lot more things to be put on the table, and it takes time for something to be deemed as classic. Like that's, it's New York bestsellers like every week.
Sure.
So we won't even know what lasts until 20,
There's
30
a
years from
legitimacy,
now.
I guess, that needs to be established with the passing of time.
Certainly. And I think the internet has done that. And I know the Baroness could speak to it, this idea of this globalization. Like, we're not just in this small pocket world anymore, right? We long to learn who our neighbors are in countries all over the place and places we haven't explored, and know that there's value in reading the stories that they have to tell.
Well, I think the push for diversity in literature also runs in cycles. There's certainly in one now.
Yes.
But in the late 80s, early 90s, when there were a lot of wars going on, when Yugoslavia was werewolfing itself out into the Balkan states, it used to be a lot of people coming here as refugees. There was a big push to get their stories told. And there's a lot of formulaic literature that came out of that era, but the idea was these people have stories that everyone's curious about that will help us empathize if we can understand them. So the vehicle, the way that a story is written became less important than what was being said. So it was okay if they all kind of sounded the same in timbre and tone and cadence, but they still were all different in what they were telling you to some degree, right? And I think now we're seeing another wave of diversity and the request for diversity in literature. And it's different because of these things, because we have the internet, because millennials have more in common with each other than with any other generation, which is an interesting phenomenon. It's because they're connected and they value their networks more than they value their nation state. So,
but that's why a good classic does that for you. It's almost like pre-phone social media. Like what you just described, I wasn't born yet, but if I read those things and I get a taste of what it must have been like for them, we're connected.
Right.
You know? It's like
and I think as you continue to read these, even going backwards, right, to read the older things and going forward to the more contemporary things, that connection is there. And then we realize that the diversity piece is really, just in many ways geography, because there are so many similarities that we have. And by reaching out and getting these works and having them accessible to everybody, then we find out that, wow.
And I don't think a piece needs to be stuffy. To be A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which I was happy to see is on here, is such a wonderful book. It's eminently readable, and I don't know why they don't teach it in high school, except it's kind of thick. It's also one of the few books, though, that the main character is a girl, which we don't get a lot of in high school. Maybe they do now. The Hunger Games opened that wide open.
It changed that a lot,
But when I was in high school, everything was about men. There was, I can't remember a single thing that we read. Well, the one with the ham costume. To Kill a Mockingbird.
To Kill a Mockingbird.
That was the only one. Which that should probably be retired at this point. But that's another story, another session, another discussion session. But yeah, so can't remember what I was saying.
Well, we do have another question, so we can jump to that. So we have Lynn on Facebook who asks, what about something like Little House on the Prairie? Prime example of a book turned TV series. A classic? And speaking of Little House on the Prairie, she also asked, does a classic lose then its status based on progress in modern society? So we've got two pieces there.
That's a very good question.
It can. I think the classic is also attributed to what the author represented. And we're seeing that now with a lot of celebrities that we all grew up with, that we all know and love, and you find out something about them, and it's like, oh man, I can't support it no more. So I think if the author of whatever said classic was really a person with love and empathy for their people and their time period, I think that would always stay.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And I mean, I've been reading lately a lot of books set in the 70s, and it's interesting what carries through and what is dated. I just recently finished rereading A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, which was really about the heroin problem in the black community in the 70s. And the heroin problem obviously has resurfaced.
Certainly.
It's different now, but a lot of the pieces of it are the same. The emotions are certainly the same. And that's what carried over. So perhaps in defining a classic, that would go into it where, and again, I think that's true with Shakespeare, with Homer, that the basic stories and the basic emotions, which is this thing that we connect with, remain the same, even if the stories change, even if the setting changes, the era.
It usually just broadens.
Yeah,
It's more inclusive now than it would have been at its original state.
Right.
Well, and I think to the point of like this turn TV series idea, we often see these books taken and put into contemporary society. So whether we have like Romeo and Juliet, where we have, what was it, Leonardo DiCaprio or whoever was in the actual movie of the, you know, the film version, so that the attempt is there to place it in. And I wonder how that affects, or does it get people more interested and to go back and read it? Like, okay, maybe this was great, but what did he really say?
I think a lot of people probably cheat the way you said your students do. I'm kind of happy that they're making, it seems to be HBO doing a lot of these video series. Olive Kitteridge was one.
Yes.
They're doing another one right now that's fairly literary. I don't remember what it was. But that's, to me, kind of neat. I don't know if again, read the book first.
Well, and it's funny because at the same time, we just got a comment from Marilyn on Facebook that said the book is always better. So,
I mean, in terms of the turn TV show or turn movie thing, it's tricky because you don't really know why exactly the people want to go see it. Is it the story, or is it because it's Leonardo DiCaprio?
exactly. Right.
And that's a real gray line, because if it's done well and it's Leo DiCaprio, then it's like, cool.
Right.
Well,
Which I
you know
think
what I
is
mean?
what
Yeah.
everybody hopes for.
Yeah,
Right.
but it
Well, I
kind of
think
doesn't
Game of
happen like
Thrones,
that.
right? Like, how many people went there or even went to the book after they knew Jason Momoa was in it?
Right.
Or whomever, you know, that it's a phenomenal story. You read this classic, it's on our list, right? But how many were drawn there? And maybe that converts the reader.
Yeah.
Like that's like I think it's
It
Why
has
I
that
read the Hardy
potential.
Boys. Sean Cassidy was
They were
cute
adorable.
when I was
Right.
7 or 9.
right. Exactly. And so it's kind of this idea also where it brings this discussion of literacy and what it means to be literate. You know, there are folks that don't agree that reading a comic book is literacy. But
Right.
to me, if you learn how to read,
That's not true.
I 100% agree with you. Absolutely.
Maybe not.
No, I agree
I was
with you.
gonna make a suggestion,
But if you lead someone to that reading, I think they're profoundly changed.
yeah.
And it stays with them. So who cares how they get there?
Well, there's a lot of verse novels that kind of try to get kids reading. There's a new type of book that's called High Low, which is high interest, low ability.
Yes.
And it's specific, and in verse novels, it's a lot more white space, and you get the when you read a book, there's something about turning the page, right, that's very satisfying.
And smelling it, that book smell, right?
But the idea of moving
Yes.
through it is
Yeah.
satisfying, and so
I was
this gets
thinking
the
about
kids
that
moving
in
through
terms
it.
of when we were talking about YouTube and movies, like reading off of a Kindle even,
You lose it.
as opposed to the actual physical book.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. And the Kindle in the bathtub is a really bad idea.
So we have another question from Lynn on Facebook who says, can you each name a book that you think is classic that we all should read? So I'm going to start first because it's my favorite book in the world, and it's halfway on the list. And I don't know,
Halfway on the list?
It's Gone with the Wind is my
Okay.
favorite. I've probably read it 100 times. It's my kind of go-to thing. I don't know why. Probably because it's one of those that I remember reading. And when I got the library card, it was one of the first ones I had
That's so
access
funny.
to, right?
I've been planning to read that book for literally the past 14 years. Every summer, I'm like, I'm going to read this book, and it propped up my window for a long time.
It props
have
up
to
mine
read
too.
it now.
But arguably it does do that. But also it's one that I can't not purchase when I see it. Like I have every version of it. But for me, it's because of that strong female character. Like
Okay.
Scarlett O'Hara, and then to see it later translated with Vivian Leigh, which was a beautiful transition. But just that strong woman that, as a child, we had The Outsiders.
Right.
We had all of the Essie Hinton, which we later found out was a woman writing it, but at that time we didn't.
I had no idea till like last week, actually. And she also wrote it when she was in high school.
Yes. So it was written in
Have
60.
you read those?
Yeah. It was 65 to 67
Right.
or something.
I
She was
think
15
she
years
just
old.
wanted her own image on the page.
On the page.
Even though
And
she wrote mostly about boys. but
exactly. So for me, it was
somebody
like,
her age.
I tracked these, Lord of the Flies, they're all boys. Like, so for Gone with the Wind, that for me was a woman. And then to later see it in Outsiders, which was just trippy, because that was
Yeah.
just what they were reading, and that was kind of cool too. So that would be where I would stand on that one.
Okay.
How about you two?
Cam?
Just looking at these, I'm kind of torn between The Outsiders, 1984, and The Alchemist. The Outsiders was probably, and Hatchet. Hatchet was really good too. But Hatchet and The Outsiders, I guess, were the first books that I really got into. Hatchet, you can understand it when you read it the first time, that transformation story. But with The Outsiders, the first time I read it, it's like, this is, gang stuff. They're fighting, beat each other up, and they're trying to run from the cops. And then the second read through, it's like, oh, there's a lot of
Family
societal,
and brotherhood
Yeah.
and societal
yeah,
issues.
like
and,
a lot of things to unpack in that it really hit deeper. So I appreciate The Outsiders because I think that sparked me to want to keep reading books.
That's cool. It's funny. I almost never read anything twice. And I'm actually reading Infinite Jest for the second time, which is hilarious to me because I kind of hate it. But I think that was the first book that I really felt like I had to read a second time to understand it, because the first time you read it, just read it viscerally, because there's so much going on and being thrown at you. And then when you read it the second time, you get, like you're talking about, that second layer. That's not the book that I would recommend everybody read by any stretch of the imagination. Most of the things that I like best, I wouldn't recommend everybody read because they are a commitment.
Yeah.
If I'm gonna pick something, I'm a huge fan of Kurt Vonnegut. But okay, no, I'm gonna say this one. This is almost commercial fiction, but I feel like it's absurd enough that it's Maria Semple, Semple, and it's called Where Do You Go, Bernadette? And the brilliant thing that I love about the book is the main character, Bernadette, you hate her for like the first 9/10 of the book. She's obnoxious, she's abrasive, she's annoying, she's kind of like me. And then you get the last piece of the puzzle, and this beautiful light comes on, and she's amazing, and so are the other people in the book that you had really come to not like. And it's sort of like an anti-hero almost.
Yeah.
It's just a brilliant little book, and it's, like I said, I like absurdism, and it has just enough absurdism, and it's a quick read. It's not stuffy.
It's
I
not a
promise.
stuffy.
So I have a question. In terms of what's on here, are they supposed to be tailored towards kids or adults or anything in between?
I think it's just
Because it's across the board.
Because
Right,
I
it's
see
across
50
the board.
Shades of Grey,
Right.
and it's like,
And
that-
Charlotte's Web.
yes.
yeah. So, in terms of, you mentioned comic books, one that is definitely classic is Watchmen.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's something
Yes.
that I feel like could easily be on here, but if this was for kids, I wouldn't, I guess. I
Right.
don't know. But if 50 Shades of Grey on here,
I think Watchmen could be on there.
Watchmen-
I think it's a
Watchmen
good, it's a
can be on
good,
there.
yeah.
Let's slide that in there. That's a whole different, it's funny, graphic novels. My sister lost her library card at one point, and somebody used it to take out 50 graphic novels. So graphic novels are like banned in our house for a long time.
Whoa.
But there are some amazing, Neil Gaiman,
Neil Gaiman
has
does a-
written
yeah.
some of the best graphic novels. And very deep, very dark, very literary. First of all, the worlds that he builds and the way that the depth of his characters and the things that he examines about the human condition are all there. And the fact that it has drawings with the words, that adds to it. And I think, if anything, graphic novels are more relevant now because of YouTube, because
They
of the
are.
movification of literature.
Even in the idea that you still get to have imagination, because the sequential art of it, you have panels,
Right.
but there's that space in between each panel
It's like the
where
close-up.
you feel it,
Right.
Right.
you
Yeah.
know? So it's like, it's not giving you everything, but it's giving you some context. And it's like
a suggestion
right.
of what everything looks like.
Exactly.
Well, and then the great piece with that is that everybody brings their own set of experiences with it. So then it goes to that lending itself to interpretation. So you're giving those, which I love how you describe it as art, because it's, I mean, it is beautiful art.
Yeah.
We're looking at, it's taking it to another level, right? But you are able to bring your experience to it, and it changes how you interpret and read it. So
Exactly.
excellent. So we have one last question from Facebook, and it's your fault. You were asked, Baroness, to Kill a Mockingbird should be retired. Why do you think so? Especially since today, when personal integrity seems to be in such short supply.
Because the book it's got great mighty whitey. Come on.
Great mighty whitey.
You know what I'm saying? It's white people are going to save the community from itself or whatever. And I think we have moved beyond that. I think we've proven, first of all, that doesn't happen ever in real life, which it's fiction. But I don't know, to me, it's a dated book. And I think there are better books with a similar story. How about The Hate You Give? Why don't we start teaching that in schools if we want to open up a dialogue about racism? That's my take on it. I don't know. Did they make you read To Kill a Mockingbird?
My school was not a good school. So we didn't really have too much reading to do.
Okay.
Like, I got The Outsiders from my cousin. He has summer reading to do.
It's like bootleg books.
Yeah,
It's
and
awesome.
I just
It's
said,
exciting.
let me hold that, and turned me on to a whole new outlet.
That's excellent. I noticed that Sister Souljah's darkest or coldest winter ever is on here.
Yes.
Which is really interesting to me. I encountered that book. I taught school briefly, in inner city school, mostly black kids, and it was 7th through 9th grade when I was there, and these 7th and 8th graders are passing this book around, and there's a lot of sex in it. It's a pretty mature book.
Watchmen could definitely be on there.
Right. I mean, it's got, but it's very realistic. It's very gritty. It's what a lot of these kids, I had pregnant 7th graders. And the problem with the book, the only problem that I had, it's written in their language, whatever, but at the end of it, she's like, these kids are just having a great time, and they're living the life, and but then at the end of it all goes horribly south. But the problem was most of the girls didn't get to the end of the book. And that's the thing. I'm like, to me, if you see a bunch of kids that are reading a book, you know what? Talk to them about it, because, and then 13 Reasons Why is when they talked young adult at the last one of these, actually, I did watch it, and one of the girls, and she's just becoming a senior, said that she had problems with 13 Reasons Why because she recognized that it romanticized suicide. So this is the thing. I felt the beginning of Sister Souljah's book romanticized, but if you read the whole book, it doesn't do that. It takes this very sharp turn to the left, and it's a really good book, and I was glad to see it on here because it's very gritty. It's written, like I said, in lingo, and I was kind of excited that it made the list.
A book that I kind of wish was on here, possibly, was Brave New World.
Oh.
I feel like...
Yeah, I was surprised that it wasn't.
I feel like if 1984 is on here, that's on par.
Well, I mean, and because we're kind of running out of time-ish, is there something on here that you don't think should be? I mean, that's kind of my curious, or not should be, but like you found odd that it was on there.
I'm for
like, am
equality.
I the only one that thought maybe Flowers in the Attic? I don't know where that came from.
But people love it,
Yes,
right? And
this is just a reading list.
Read.
Yes, this isn't necessarily.
I mean, if we're calling Flowers in the Attic literature, I need to move to Mars. And my sister, I read it vicariously because she read it at me.
Sure.
But it's guilty pleasure when you're there. And I think every generation has its version of that, right? Like the Twilight series kind of dips into that a little bit. Yeah. So we had that vampire lady too.
I think Stephanie Meyer, and I think that that would be 50 Shades, because that would have been like, and I didn't go near that one.
Yeah.
But
we're too old now.
Like that's what it is. Like
it's not fun anymore.
Not gonna do it. But
The Giver is a good one too.
The Giver's a great one.
I like all the books by that author.
I feel like it would be too subjective to say what shouldn't be on here.
What surprised you? Not shouldn't. What surprised you that is on here? Yes.
Maybe Twilight, I guess, but I could see why I would be surprised. But when I look at it in a culture sense, I get it. It did a lot.
Like I said, I was happily surprised that Sister Souljah's book was on here.
a lot of these seem like books that, people would suggest even if they never read it. Like, these seem
Yes.
like buzzword books.
That's almost the definition of a classic, right?
Yeah, like some of these just seem like
It's on my
buzzword books.
bookshelf. Yeah,
Well,
I
and it's
totally
it's
agree with
really
that.
cool. I mean, I appreciate that this list is here and that you can vote for it, but also it's now something I can check off. Oh my gosh, I missed this one. I'm going to go down
Right.
the. I mean, I'll still skip those other two, but the rest I think I'll at least give a good try.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
But I thank you both very much for being
Yeah,
here
of
today. It's been
course.
awesome. We could probably talk for 4 hours, but nobody'd want to hear us.
Right.
So thank you. It was a really quick time. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you
Yeah,
again so
thank
much.
you for having
problem.
us. Nice to
And thank
meet
you all for watching and participating. If you enjoyed this, you can keep the conversation going in WNED's Great American Read Book Club. To join, you go to the WNED Facebook page and then click on the group tab on the left side of the page, and that's where you'll find the book club. I'd also like to take a moment again to thank our partners in the Great American Read, the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, Talking Leaves Books, and Just Buffalo Literary Center. Together, we will be hosting a special screening of What Makes a Great Book, along with video of local readers and authors on Thursday, October 4th at 5:30 p.m. at the studios. Check WNED.org for free tickets and for other information. Also, the Great American Read series resumes on Tuesday, September 11th at 8 p.m. on WNED TV. Every day, readers can vote for their favorite book at WNED.org or on social media, and the winner will be revealed during the series finale on October 23rd. After the finale, join us right here on WNED's Facebook page for a discussion about what America chose. And I'm sure you're all going to have awesome opinions about it, so we look forward to hearing it. So thank you very much for your time, and take care.
Signing off.
Thank you for joining us for WNED's Facebook Live presentation of The Great American Read, a discussion on what makes a book classic. To cast your vote for your favorite book or for more information, go to the Great American Read section of WNED.org. Major